Edward Mitchell, 73, was publicly humiliated at his local bank, mocked, ignored, and treated like a burden. No one came to his defense until Jasmine Crockett, a fearless black civil rights attorney, stepped through the door. Within just 5 minutes, she turned the entire bank upside down. What did Jasmine uncover, buried in plain sight, that the bank had spent years desperately trying to keep hidden from the public? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The bank was a pressure cooker, crowded, noisy, intense. Customers shuffled in long lines, sighing, muttering, checking watches. The buzz of printers and muffled conversations filled the air. At the back, Edward Mitchell stood quietly, almost lost in the chaos. His white hair was neatly combed, his clothes simple but clean. In his hands, a worn brown envelope, bent at the corners, packed with old receipts and printed statements, was all he had. A retired civil engineer, now living alone, he depended entirely on his modest pension. Edward's heart beat faster with each passing minute. The unexpected fees on his account had shaken him, small at first, then growing. He hadn't been warned, and now every dollar mattered. Still, he believed it was a mistake. "I just need to explain," he whispered to himself, gripping the envelope tighter. "They'll understand," he told himself quietly. "They'll fix it. It has to be a mistake." But as he looked around, at the impatient faces and indifferent staff, doubt crept in. He wasn't sure if anyone would truly listen, or if they ever had. But Edward's hope began to falter. The moment he reached the counter, he shuffled forward slowly, trying not to hold up the line behind him, clutching his worn envelope like a lifeline. Behind the plexiglass sat Lindsay Cooper, mid-20s, glossy hair, heavy mascara. A smartphone practically fused to her hand. Her eyes were locked on the screen, thumbs moving fast. Too fast to be work-related. Her neon pink nails tapped the glass counter, in rhythm with her scrolling. Edward hesitated for a second, then gently cleared his throat. She didn't look up, not right away. When she finally did, it was with a sigh that seemed disproportionate to the situation, like someone being asked to pause an important meeting, not a text conversation. Her eyes met Edward's for a brief, hollow second, then dropped to the brown envelope in his hand. He forced a small smile, the kind that carried more anxiety than warmth, and slid a printed statement toward her, with careful hands. "Excuse me, miss," he said softly, voice gravelly with age, but steady. "I noticed some new charges on my account. I don't quite understand what they're for. I was hoping someone could help me go over them." Lindsay glanced at the page, didn't even pick it up. Her expression didn't change. No confusion, no curiosity, no concern, just indifference. She lazily leaned forward, tapped a few keys on her keyboard, then said flatly, "That's the monthly maintenance fee." No greeting, no explanation, just a verdict. Edward blinked, unsure if he'd misheard her. "I've had this account for over 15 years, he said, trying to stay calm. "I've never been charged that before. Not once." He adjusted his posture, instinctively straightening his back, the way he used to, when presenting engineering reports to project boards. "There must have been some kind of change I wasn't informed about." Lindsay finally picked up the paper, but only to slide it back across the counter with a fingernail. She didn't bother hiding the condescension in her voice. "It's in the agreement you signed. Maybe you just didn't read the fine print." That stung. Edward's eyebrows drew in slightly, not with anger, but with shame. He had read the paperwork years ago, when his eyesight was sharper and the world felt less hostile. Now, everything felt like a trick, hidden behind asterisks and legalese. "I did read it," he replied gently, "but this wasn't there, and no one at the branch ever mentioned any changes to me." Lindsay shrugged. "We're not required to notify you in person. That's what the emails are for." "I don't use email," Edward admitted quietly. "I've always come here to speak with someone directly. That's how I manage my account." Lindsay smirked, not cruelly, just dismissively. Well, that's kind of the problem, isn't it? She folded her arms. You're a little out of touch with how things work these days. The words landed like a slap. Edward felt his ears burn, not from heat, but humiliation. He heard someone behind him shift, impatiently. Maybe someone sighed, maybe not. But in that moment, it felt like the whole room was watching an old man lose control over something as basic as his own money. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His throat felt tight. His hands, still gripping the envelope, had started to tremble ever so slightly. Lindsay looked past him, at the next customer in line. Is there anything else I can help you with? She asked as if the matter was closed, but the words hit harder than Edward expected, sharper, colder, and far more public than he was prepared for. For a split second, there was silence, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that echoes right before a room shifts, before judgment creeps in. Then came the first signs, a subtle clearing of the throat from the man 2 people back, the soft whisper of clothing as someone leaned sideways, craning their neck for a better look. A middle-aged woman near the ATM nudged her partner and nodded toward the counter. Eyebrows lifted, the man beside her gave a crooked half smile, amused, and then it spread, like wildfire. Tiny movements, stolen glances, the soundless exchange of reactions, the kind of moment where no one says anything out loud, but everyone's already decided what side they're on. Edward felt it all, the invisible weight of every eye that landed on him, the tiny tick of disapproval, the irritation at the delay, the assumptions, forming without context. In their eyes, he wasn't a man standing up for fairness. He was an old man who didn't get how things worked, an inconvenience. His heart pounded, not from anger, but from the suffocating sense that he had just been labeled in front of strangers, reduced, ridiculed, unwelcome. He shifted awkwardly, trying to move aside without drawing more attention. But his legs felt stiff, his body heavy. He could hear someone exhale sharply behind him, a sigh that wasn't just impatience, it was judgment. Lindsay, still behind the glass, had already turned her attention elsewhere, her fingers now dancing, back over her phone. To her, the moment was over. Case closed. But for Edward, the humiliation was just beginning. His face flushed with heat, as if he'd been slapped. His ears burned. He looked down at the envelope in his hands. It was wrinkled now, the corners bent inward from where he'd clenched it. It had once been neat, organized, a quiet symbol of preparation, of dignity. Now, it felt childish, pointless. His voice, which he had carefully measured a minute ago, now seemed far away, like it belonged to someone else. In that instant, he was no longer the man who had spent decades supervising construction sites, managing crises, commanding respect. He was a ghost of that man, standing in a fluorescent-lit bank lobby, being dismissed like someone who couldn't read their own bills. It felt like standing in front of a classroom again, being scolded for something he didn't understand, while everyone stared and no one helped. Except this time, he wasn't a child. He was 73, and somehow, that made it hurt more. Just as Edward stepped slightly back from the counter, his cheeks still burning, a voice rang out, sharp, authoritative, almost theatrical in its delivery. "Is there a problem here?" The sound cut through the room like a judge's gavel. Conversation slowed. Even the printer in the corner seemed to quiet. Heads turned, and then he appeared. Brian Douglas, the branch manager, emerging from a side office, like an actor taking center stage. He walked with tight, deliberate strides, dress shoes echoing with each step against the polished tile. His suit fit like armor, dark navy, crisp collar, not a wrinkle in sight. His hair was slicked back, his jaw clenched. He didn't just walk, he arrived, exuding the kind of presence that demanded submission, not trust. His eyes moved fast, first to Lindsay, then to Edward. And just like that, the look happened. A single sweep of the eyes, the top to bottom scan. The kind of glance that didn't just assess, but categorized. Edward saw it. He felt it. In his bones. He wasn't a customer. He was a problem. A time waster. A statistic. Someone out of touch. Dragging his worn shoes through a place no longer meant for people like him. Brian didn't even nod at Edward. His attention snapped straight to Lindsay. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone already laced with irritation, as though he were entering a room mid-emergency and was clearly the most competent person in it. Lindsay, eager to shift the spotlight off herself, answered quickly. "He's just having trouble understanding the new fees," she said, went with a shrug. The he landed like a kick. Edward wasn't even Mr. Mitchell anymore. He was just a pronoun, a mild inconvenience. Edward cleared his throat and stepped forward, refusing to let the narrative run without him. "With respect," he began, his voice calm but charged with quiet frustration. "I'm not having trouble understanding. I'm trying to clarify why these charges suddenly started showing up after all these years. I've had this account for over 15 years, and I've never seen this fee before." Brian turned to him fully now, arms crossed, chin lifted slightly, as if the mere act of responding was an effort. "It's in the policy," he said bluntly. "We updated the fee structure last year. Notifications were sent to all customers, via email and digital banking." Edward nodded slowly, trying to stay composed. "I don't use email. I've never signed up for online banking. I handle everything in person. That's how I've always managed my account." Brian raised one brow, barely masking his annoyance. "That may be how you've chosen to do things," he replied, "but that's not how the world works anymore." There it was, the line, the wall. Edward's lips parted, but no sound came out. Not yet. Brian went on, not giving him room to reply. "We serve tens of thousands of customers," he continued, voice firm, calculated. "We can't tailor our system to individual preferences. It's your responsibility to stay informed. If you're unable to maintain the required balance to avoid fees, maybe this bank isn't the right fit for your needs." The sentence hit with brutal efficiency. There was no apology, no empathy, just a polite way of saying, "Take your business elsewhere if you can't keep up." The words weren't loud, but they echoed like a gavel in Edward's ears. He felt the pressure behind his eyes building, the kind that comes not from anger, but from being completely, utterly dismissed. No discussion, no investigation, just policy. Edward didn't respond, not because he didn't have words, but because none of them felt like they would matter. The silence that followed Brian's remark wasn't empty. It was full of something colder. Finality. The kind of silence that settles after a door has been shut in your face. Not slammed, but gently, politely, decisively. Brian had already turned away, signaling with his body language that the conversation was over. Lindsay had gone back to her screen, eyes glazed, fingers tapping. The line behind Edward inched forward, people in it no longer paying attention or pretending not to. But Edward could still feel it, that weightless, invisible rejection that didn't make a sound but screamed in his chest. He didn't yell. He didn't protest. Instead, he simply lowered his gaze, slowly reaching for the paper that had been pushed back toward him like trash no one wanted to deal with. His hand trembled slightly as he gathered the papers, trying not to let them scatter. No one helped. No one even looked. As he clutched the crumpled envelope to his chest, a quiet thought formed in the back of his mind. Simple, heavy, and cruel in its honesty. I just came here to ask a question, but they've made me feel like I'm the problem. The realization cut deeper than any policy or fee ever could. It wasn't the charge that hurt most. It was the message beneath it. You don't belong here anymore. The air in the bank felt colder now, tighter, as if the room itself had pushed him out. He turned slightly, not sure whether to leave or try one last time. but his body already knew the answer. His dignity was in retreat, step by step, paper by paper. No one stopped him. No one said a word. And in that moment, surrounded by marble floors, glowing screen, and laminated smiles, Edward Mitchell became invisible. Edward was frozen in place, still clutching the wrinkled envelope to his chest, his dignity unraveling by the second. He didn't know what to do. Step forward, speak up again, or simply walk out and swallow the humiliation. The buzzing in his ears drowned out the ambient noise of the bank. Even the voices of Brian and Lindsay seemed far away now, as if they were speaking underwater. He felt like a man slowly disappearing in plain sight. And then a voice, clear, calm, not loud, but impossible to ignore. "Excuse me," it said, the syllables sharp as glass. "He's not asking for special treatment. He's asking for his legal rights." The effect was immediate. The atmosphere in the bank shifted, as if someone had pulled the oxygen from the room. Heads turned. Fast. The customer service agent at counter 4 stopped mid-sentence. A man standing near the coin deposit machine straightened up and squinted toward the sound. Brian Douglas's stride halted in mid-step. Even Lindsay's fingers froze above her keyboard, suspended in mid-air. It wasn't just what the voice said. It was how it was said, with a tone that didn't plead, didn't suggest, but commanded. All eyes locked on the woman standing halfway across the floor. She wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't flustered. She simply stood, shoulders square, eyes steady, one hand resting on the strap of a structured leather bag. Jasmine Crockett. Her name didn't need announcing. It carried itself in the air. Her slate gray blazer looked sharper than any suit in the building. Her curls were pinned back with effortless confidence, but it was the look in her eyes, fierce, focused, and completely unmoved by protocol, that told everyone. They were no longer in control of this narrative. Jasmine didn't break eye contact. Her gaze was locked onto Brian, like a scalpel finding its target. She'd seen everything. The dismissive tone, the shrug from Lindsay, the cold shutdown. She didn't need to hear the entire conversation. She understood the playbook. She'd seen it in courtroom after courtroom, boardroom after boardroom, people in power reducing the elderly to afterthoughts, wrapping injustice in polite language and policy manuals. "No one here is asking for favors," she continued, stepping forward now, slow and deliberate. "What you just witnessed was an elder being stonewalled over unexplained deductions from his account and told, essentially, to leave if he couldn't keep up." A hush had settled over the entire room, like the moment before a storm touches ground. Edward turned toward the voice, blinking, as if he were emerging from fog. He didn't know who she was, not exactly, but everything about her, her poise, her words, the heat in her voice, struck something inside him that had been buried. Hope. For the first time that day, someone had stepped between him and the system, not to explain it, but to challenge it. And for the first time, Brian didn't have an immediate answer. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The script he was used to reading from no longer applied. Jasmine Crockett was here now, and the rules had just changed. From the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped forward, the atmosphere in the bank shifted from passive discomfort to electric tension. She didn't storm. She didn't shout. She dissected, like a skilled surgeon entering a trauma scene. She moved with the calm of someone who had done this before, hundreds of times. Her heels clicked softly against the polished tile as she approached Edward, who stood still, stunned by her presence, and unsure whether to speak. She offered him a gentle nod, not pity, but respect, before extending her hand toward the crumpled envelope in his grip. "May I?" she asked, her voice low, but commanding. Edward, still processing everything, gave a faint nod and handed her the envelope, as if passing a sacred object. She took it with both hands, smoothing the edges as she opened it with clinical precision. Unfolding each document, her eyes scanning quickly, sharply, completely locked in. She didn't speak immediately. Her eyes darted from line to line, account statements, dates, transaction codes. A silence fell over the room again, this one thicker, heavier, because everyone knew what came next would change everything. Edward's breath caught as he watched her work. Part of him terrified that even she wouldn't find anything wrong, that maybe the system really was just how things worked. But that fear didn't last long. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her lips tightening into a razor-thin line. And then she looked up. Not at Edward, but directly at Brian. "These charges," she said slowly, holding up a printed page between her fingers like a courtroom exhibit, "started appearing the month after his pension deposits became irregular. That timing isn't random. That timing is calculated." Brian shifted. "Ma'am," he began, carefully selecting his words, "we apply fees in accordance with head office policy. Everything is automated and—" Jasmine raised one hand, stopping him mid-sentence with the effortless authority of a judge sustaining her own objection. "I know what your policies say," she said firmly. "I've read them, probably more times than you have. I'm a financial regulatory attorney. I work in federal oversight. I've litigated against institutions twice your size, for less than what's happening here." A murmur rippled through the lobby. Lindsay stiffened behind the counter, her eyes now darting between Jasmine and Brian. One of the tellers leaned in slightly, trying to catch every word. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but the intensity behind it was unmistakable. She stepped forward, closing the distance between her and Brian without hesitation. Her movements were precise, her words sharpened to the point of a blade. "You're not just overcharging a customer," she continued, tapping the paper with the back of her nail. "You're penalizing him because he's no longer receiving steady income. You're applying maintenance fees, conveniently, only when his deposits drop below threshold, and without any formal notification, verbal or written, accessible to someone who's never opted into digital banking. That is not policy, that is predation." Brian tried to stand his ground, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve like it might give him more authority. "Look, I don't write the rule," he said. "We're just following the structure our systems are set to." "No," Jasmine cut in, voice like steel. "You're hiding behind automation as a shield from misconduct. You think if you embed exploitation deep enough in the system, no one will notice. But I'm standing here. I noticed. And now, everyone else has too." She turned slightly, raising her voice, not to yell, but to project, making sure every customer in the bank could hear her. "How many of you have seen unexplained charges on your accounts? How many of you have spoken up, only to be told you didn't understand the fine print?" A few hands hesitantly rose. An elderly man near the deposit slip station nodded. A middle-aged woman clutched her purse tighter, eyes wide with realization. "This," Jasmine said, sweeping the paper slightly in the air, "is systemic targeting of vulnerable customers, specifically the elderly. And if I run a forensic audit on the transaction patterns across your branch's account holders, especially those over 65, I guarantee this isn't an isolated incident." Brian's confidence visibly cracked. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. At first, then, "If there's an error, we can correct it. There's no need to—" "Oh, it's not just an error anymore," Jasmine replied, cutting in smoothly. "It's a pattern, and patterns have consequences." She turned back to Edward, her entire tone shifting in an instant. The fire in her voice softened to warmth. "Mr. Mitchell, thank you for standing up and questioning something that didn't sit right. Most people wouldn't. Most people would have walked out in silence." Edward blinked, overwhelmed, not just by her words, but by the fierce clarity with which she saw him. Not as a nuisance, not as an outdated relic, but as a man who had been wronged. I didn't know what to do," he said quietly. "I just wanted someone to look." "Well," she said, turning back to Brian one last time, her voice now low but laced with finality. "Now everyone's looking." The room was completely still. The only sound was the low hum of fluorescent lights and the soft rustle of someone shifting nervously in line. Brian looked pale now. His posture, once stiff and commanding, had loosened. He knew this wasn't something he could sweep under the rug. Not anymore. Not with her here. Jasmine handed the documents back to Edward, placing them carefully into his hands, like returning evidence to its rightful owner. "We're not done," she said, to no one and everyone. "But we've started." And just like that, the balance of power in the room had shifted, not through shouting, not through chaos, but through truth, spoken clearly, by someone who refused to let injustice hide behind a smile and a suit. Jasmine's final words still echoed in the room. "Now everyone's looking." And they were. For a few long, charged seconds, no one moved. The lobby stood frozen, as if time itself had paused to absorb what had just happened. Jasmine's presence alone had shaken the ground beneath the bank's polished floors, but what happened next would fracture the very walls of silence that had held for too long. From the second row of chairs, an elderly woman slowly raised her hand. It was a small gesture, gentle, almost shy, but it pierced the tension like a whistle in a minefield. She wore a soft lavender cardigan, her silver gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes, though tired, were steady. She didn't stand. She didn't shout. She simply lifted her hand and said, "I've lost nearly $200 over the last few months. I didn't know why." No one explained anything. There was a moment of stillness, then movement. People began turning toward her. Some were surprised. Some weren't. Jasmine turned too, nodding, encouraging the woman with a soft look that said, "You're safe to speak now." Before Brian could react, another voice chimed in, from the back near the deposit slips. An older man, East Asian, wearing a faded bomber jacket and a Yankees cap. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "I thought it was just me," he said quietly. "I thought maybe I didn't read the terms right. I never finished high school. I blame myself." His words landed like stones in a glass building. There was no anger in his tone, only resignation. And beneath that, shame. The kind of shame engineered by institutions that rely on confusion to keep the vulnerable quiet. The kind that turns personal responsibility into weaponized guilt. Jasmine turned to face Brian again, her expression now transformed. No longer merely firm, it was burning with the kind of righteous fury that doesn't raise its voice, but amplifies through precision. "Sir," she said, each word deliberate, "when one person raises a concern, maybe it's a misunderstanding. When two speak up, maybe it's a coincidence. But when half a dozen elderly customers start realizing they've all been charged in ways they can't explain, ways you can't explain," she stepped forward, her heels echoing through the silence. "That is no longer a technical issue. That's not confusion. That's a scheme." Brian tried to hold her gaze, but the flicker in his eyes betrayed him. He swallowed hard. For the first time since entering the conversation, he looked like a man without a script. His confident posture sagged ever so slightly, and his eyes darted toward Lindsay. But Lindsay was no longer backing him. She stared at the floor, lips pressed shut, as if she knew the tide had turned. Jasmine didn't stop. She gestured broadly now, addressing the room, not just the staff, not just the manager, but every soul within earshot. This isn't a mistake. This is a mechanism, a system built on silence and complexity. You prey on confusion. You use policies like traps and digital communication as camouflage. You charge fees when people are most vulnerable, when their income drops, when they stop receiving direct deposits, when they're no longer logging into email, and you do it because you bet they won't fight back. Another murmur rolled through the room. It wasn't noise, it was awakening. A wave of realization, spreading face to face, eye to eye. Jasmine turned back to the elderly woman in the lavender cardigan. "Ma'am," she asked gently, "did anyone ever send you a letter or call you about those charges?" The woman shook her head. No, she said. Just statements. I don't check them online. My daughter handles email. I only came in today because I needed to order a new card. Jasmine nodded, then turned to the man in the Yankees cap. And you? He hesitated, then said, I got one email. It was full of legal terms I didn't understand, so I ignored it. Jasmine turned back to Brian and said flatly, You're relying on digital exclusion. You're taking advantage of people who aren't digitally fluent, and you're designing your entire communication strategy around non-responsiveness. That's not oversight. That's a business model. The words hit like thunder. Brian opened his mouth, some reflex buried deep inside trying to do damage control. But Jasmine cut him off before he could utter a single word. I've seen this before. Banks layering predatory structures under the guise of modernization. You shift the rules, bury the notifications, automate the deductions, and wash your hands of it all by blaming the system. She stepped closer now, her tone lowering. Not out of weakness, but to make every syllable hit harder. But you forget the human cost. You forget these people have names, histories, families. You forget they built the world you're trying to charge them to stay in. Edward stood still beside her, speechless. Not out of fear this time, but awe. The woman beside him had just named the pain he hadn't been able to describe. The loneliness, the guilt, the doubt. All of it, reframed in truth, in justice. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Across the lobby, more customers began murmuring. A woman in her 60s pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures of the posted fee policies. A man whispered to his wife, then stepped out of line and moved toward Edward. Sir, he said quietly, I think the same thing's happening to my dad's account. Can we talk? Jasmine heard him and nodded. You're not alone, she said. None of you are. Brian raised both hands slightly on trying to regain control. Listen, we're willing to review these accounts. I'll escalate this to the regional office. There's no need to... To what? Jasmine interrupted. To keep things quiet? To protect your job? You had your chance to do the right thing when Mr. Mitchell asked for help, but you dismissed him. You humiliated him. And now that the lights are on, you want to pull the curtains back down? No one moved, not even the staff behind the counters. One of them had quietly stepped away and was now speaking to someone on the phone in a low voice. Maybe corporate, maybe legal. Jasmine let the silence stretch a moment longer. Then she pulled a slim notepad from her bag and scribbled a number on it. She handed it to Edward. This is my office line. We'll be starting a formal complaint and class action. I want you to be the first name on the list. Edward took the paper with trembling hands. He tried to speak, but no words came out, only a deep breath, thick with gratitude. Jasmine turned to the crowd and spoke one final time. You deserve clarity. You deserve respect. And if no one gives it to you, you have every right to demand it. And in that moment, the bank wasn't just a financial institution. It was a courtroom, a battleground, a stage. And Jasmine Crockett had just given voice to every person who'd ever felt small, at the mercy of a machine pretending to be neutral. And the silence that followed was no longer one of shame. It was power, waiting to rise. The room was no longer a bank lobby. It was a courtroom, with no judge, no jury, just truth standing on one side and excuses collapsing on the other. Jasmine stood tall, hands folded at her waist, a calm storm in a sharp blazer. Customers surrounded her now, not physically, but in presence. Their silence wasn't passive anymore. It was electric, heavy with realization. Cell phones were out, quietly recording, camera lights blinking in corners. One employee at the far end of the counter had her phone pointed discreetly at Brian. Another, previously stone-faced, was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot. The illusion of control had shattered, and Brian Douglas knew it. He tried to hold the line, keep his voice even, but his throat betrayed him. It caught, on the first word. We, we haven't reviewed every account yet, he stammered, avoiding Jasmine's gaze, eyes darting to the ceiling, then the marble floor, then nowhere in particular. There's a possibility that some several hundred accounts could have been affected. He said it too fast, as if hoping speed would dull the impact, but it didn't. The words hit like a dropped microphone. A few people gasped. Someone dropped a pen. Lindsay's face went ghostly white behind the glass. Jasmine didn't blink. She leaned in slightly, her voice steady, unwavering, each syllable designed to land like a verdict. You just admitted to a systemic financial abuse of senior citizens, hundreds of accounts, unauthorized or unexplained deductions, no real consent, no notice. Brian opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, and her tone shifted from direct to surgical. Thank you, she said. You've just made my case. Then she reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and raised it slowly, already recording. She didn't need to yell. She didn't need to point. She simply lifted the phone and let her words do the cutting. For the record, she said calmly into the camera, this is a branch manager at a national bank confirming that his location may have deducted fees from potentially hundreds of elderly clients' accounts, without proper review or transparency. We'll be forwarding this to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the State Attorney General, and any class action legal teams currently building cases against exploitative banking practices. Brian took a step back, his jaw clenched, sweat formed on his forehead. Barely visible, but undeniably there. He was unraveling, and everyone could see it. The polished image, the corporate posture, the thin layer of authority, it was all falling away like stage makeup under a hot spotlight. Please, he said quickly, voice finally breaking. We can fix this. I can fix it. There's no need to escalate. Fixing this, Jasmine cut in sharply, lowering her phone, but not her tone, does not mean quietly refunding a few accounts and hoping we forget. Fixing this means accountability. It means transparency. It means investigating every affected customer, especially those who didn't even realize they were being drained month by month. She took one step closer. Her voice dropped, but every word now echoed like a gavel. You gambled on silence, she said. You banked on confusion. And you thought no one would question it because your victims were too old, too tired, or too disconnected to notice. Brian's hands were trembling now, subtle but visible. He glanced around the room, realizing he had no allies left. Not even Lindsay, not the tellers, not the customers. All of them were watching, recording, remembering. Jasmine pointed to Edward without turning. This man came in for help. You gave him humiliation. She gestured to the older woman in lavender. She lost money for months. You gave her indifference. She looked back at Brian. And now that you're caught, all you have to offer is panic. Brian tried again. If you give us some time, if we could just... There is no time left, Jasmine said coldly. The time was when Edward first walked in. The time was when she first noticed missing funds. The time was when your employee dismissed a senior citizen with condescension, instead of compassion. Another murmur rippled through the room, louder now. People weren't just observers anymore. They were witnesses. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was exposure. And Jasmine Crockett had peeled the mask off a machine that had long operated in the shadows. She turned back to Edward, her voice gentler. We're going to make sure this isn't brushed aside, Mr. Mitchell. You've done something bigger than you realize. Edward stood speechless, his hand still clutching the envelope that started it all. His heart was pounding, not from fear anymore, but from something new, vindication. He nodded slowly, unsure if he could speak without choking on emotion. Jasmine slipped her phone into her bag, then faced the rest of the lobby. If you believe you've been affected, she said, addressing everyone now, stay. Speak. Share your stories. This is no longer about one account. This is about every person who's ever been told they're too old to understand what's being taken from them. The tension that had once pressed down on the room had reversed. It was rising now, boiling into momentum. The bank manager's silence had become damning. The lobby had become a megaphone. The customers, once quiet, were now voices waiting to be heard. And Jasmine, she wasn't leaving with a complaint. She was leaving with a movement. Brian's silence said everything. But Jasmine wasn't done. She had cracked the dam. Now it was time to let it flood. Without breaking stride, she reached back into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, faster than any of the bank staff could react. She wasn't calling for backup. She was activating a network. With the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before, Jasmine opened a secure app, tapped into her contact list, and began sending voice memos, short texts, live alerts, legal clinics, consumer watchdogs, independent media outlets. By the time she looked up again, the story had already left the building. She turned to the crowd. "Journalists are on their way," she announced clearly, "and so are attorneys. If you've been affected, or even if you think you might have been, start gathering your paperwork. Start documenting everything." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the force of a public siren. The bank lobby, once tense with embarrassment and silent suffering, had become a war room. The reaction was immediate. Customers began digging into purses, wallets, tote bags. Printed statements unfolded. Folders snapped open. Receipts spilled onto countertops. Phone cameras lit up. Some began filming Jasmine. Others pointed lenses at Brian, still frozen near the counter, blinking rapidly as if trying to wake from a nightmare. One elderly woman in a floral blouse began flipping through a spiral-bound notebook, comparing handwritten balance notes with the bank's transaction logs. Another customer was already live streaming the chaos to over 800 viewers on a neighborhood social media page. Truth was viral now, and nothing could contain it. The bank staff panicked quietly. Lindsay whispered something to a coworker, then stepped away from her terminal and disappeared through a door marked "Staff Only." The branch supervisor, a man no one had seen until now, suddenly emerged from the glass office in the back, phone to his ear, beads of sweat forming at his temple. His voice was urgent, low, fast. He was calling someone, high up. But the power had already slipped from corporate hands. Jasmine hadn't just sparked outrage. She had created witnesses. Within minutes, the bank's entire internal structure began to buckle under scrutiny. A digital news crew arrived faster than anyone expected. 2 reporters with press badges, one carrying a mic, the other already rolling. They bypassed the reception desk and made a straight line toward Jasmine, who greeted them not as a victim, but as a general briefing the media at the front line of injustice. Behind her, Edward stood holding his now famous envelope, like a flag that had somehow survived the battle. "We have confirmation," Jasmine told the reporters, "from the branch manager himself. Hundreds of elderly accounts may have been systematically targeted with unexplained maintenance fees, fees that appear to begin precisely when pension deposits stop or drop. There was no formal consent, no clear warning. This is financial abuse disguised as policy." Cameras flashed. A journalist asked if federal regulators had been notified. "They have now," Jasmine replied. "I've already sent the preliminary clip to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the State Attorney General's office. Legal teams are reviewing this moment by moment." The branch supervisor stepped forward, his face pale. "Ms. Crockett," he said, almost breathless, We've just received instructions from Central Compliance. Mr. Douglas has been placed on immediate administrative leave pending internal investigation. A full audit will begin today." His words were carefully measured, but hollow. His voice cracked at the edges. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The victory didn't roar. It rippled. Brian stood motionless, his carefully sculpted image now crumbling in real time. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply turned, walked toward the hallway, and vanished into the back of the bank, a ghost of authority erased by accountability. But Jasmine wasn't done. She turned to the remaining staff. The rest of you, start assisting these people. Print their statements, pull their histories, provide them with written summaries of every fee you've ever charged. Do not deflect. Do not delay. I will remain here to ensure compliance, and our legal volunteers will be joining shortly to document every account reviewed. And they obeyed. Tellers who had once looked bored now looked sharp and serious. Printers whirred to life. The lobby filled with movement. But it wasn't chaos. It was clarity. Every step had purpose. Every customer became an investigator. People compared notes, shared screenshots. An elderly couple, who had never spoken to each other in the waiting chairs, were now side by side checking dates and transaction codes. The bank had never felt more alive, and yet it had never looked more exposed. As the hours ticked on, the entire operation transformed from passive institution to site of a financial uprising. News vans parked outside. Attorneys set up temporary check-in points by the coffee station. Clipboards passed from hand to hand. Jasmine stood at the center of it all, not giving interviews for attention, but providing coordination, direction, and legal insight. She was organizing a crowd that had, only an hour ago, been fractured by shame and confusion. Now, they were aligned, awake, and angry. By late afternoon, the bank released its first official public statement. It arrived in the form of a corporate tweet and a printed letter posted at the front entrance. We are aware of the concerns raised at our downtown branch and take them seriously. An emergency internal audit is underway to review all maintenance fee activity. Any accounts affected will be contacted and refunded where appropriate. We thank our community for holding us accountable. But it was too late for half measures. The story had already gone national. Jasmine had uploaded the footage, full and unedited, to public channels. Edward's story was already being shared across thousands of timelines. Respect for seniors began trending by the time the sun dipped low over the glass windows. Every repost carried the same truth. One man stood up, and one woman refused to let him fall alone. And in that bank, where policy once silenced people, a movement had taken root. Not in speeches but in actions. Not in anger, but in unbreakable resolve. The system had counted on confusion. It had bet on silence. But Jasmine Crockett bet on truth. And truth, it turned out, was louder than everything. The sun had long set by the time the chaos settled, but justice, as always, was fashionably late and painfully earned. The bank, under pressure from regulators, lawyers, and a media storm that refused to die, was forced to act quickly and decisively. An emergency audit uncovered not dozens, but hundreds of affected accounts, all tied together by a clear pattern: low monthly balances, irregular deposit histories, and a common demographic thread: age. For far too long, customers like Edward had been quietly drained, dollar by dollar, cent by cent, under the camouflage of standard policy. Now, under a spotlight they couldn't dim, the institution did what all exposed giants do. It paid to protect itself. Edward was invited back, not through a cold-form letter or a robotic voicemail, but with a formal, hand-delivered apology. The regional director himself stood beside a compliance officer as they slid a certified check across the table. The amount reflected every penny lost to unjustified fees, and then some. It included a goodwill adjustment, though everyone in the room knew what it really was: a public settlement to buy silence that would never come. Edward didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked down at the check, then back at the men, and said quietly, "I never wanted compensation. I wanted someone to listen." His voice didn't shake, but theirs did. They thanked him, but their gratitude felt hollow next to the weight of what he'd endured. Across the city, and soon the country, stories multiplied. Customers from other branches came forward. Seniors in retirement homes asked their children to check their accounts. Veterans, widows, teachers, factory workers. Voices that had been told they were too old to matter were suddenly the center of the conversation. Bank executives issued press releases full of legal jargon, promises of transparency, new customer protections. It wasn't guilt, it was containment, but the damage was already done. Jasmine Crockett had ensured that the receipts didn't disappear into filing cabinets. She took them to courtrooms, to newsrooms, to the floor of the state assembly. And she didn't go alone. A week after the incident, Edward stood beside her again. This time not in a bank lobby, but on the set of a national news broadcast. Cameras rolled. The host leaned in. Lights burned white hot. Jasmine sat poised, a calm force of reckoning in a storm of spin. The anchor asked her what this all meant, why this moment had resonated with millions across the country. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. When the elderly are treated like burdens, she said, her voice slow, each word a hammer striking steel, society doesn't just lose its compassion. It loses its memory. It loses its values. It loses its sense of justice. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle across the room. These aren't just clients. These are our teachers, our builders, our protectors, our parents. When you rob them of dignity, you rob the rest of us of the very foundation we stand on. The host didn't speak. No one dared to interrupt. Beside her, Edward sat with his hands folded in his lap, the same envelope in his coat pocket, not because he needed it now, but because it had become a symbol, a reminder of how something so small, so ordinary that it could become a weapon in the hands of the right voice. When the interview wrapped, the cameras faded to black, but the moment didn't end. Jasmine turned to Edward, reached out her hand, and this time, he didn't hesitate. He rose, took her hand firmly, and looked her in the eye. "I never thought anyone would stand up for me," he said. "For people like me. I thought we were just supposed to accept it. Be quiet, move on." His voice was stronger now, not because the pain was gone, but because he had found something stronger than pain, vindication. He tightened his grip slightly and said, with a steady nod, "But today, I know better. I know that when you're right, you speak up." Jasmine smiled, not the rehearsed kind politicians give, but the rare kind that says, "You did it." Outside the studio, the air was cool. A small crowd had gathered, holding signs with Edward's name, wearing pins that read, "Number Justice for Seniors." There were college students, retired nurses, bus drivers, veterans, a teenager on crutches who helped his grandmother navigate a new checking app. They weren't protesting. They were witnessing. One by one, they approached Edward, not like a victim, but like a survivor who spoke for all of them. Later that month, the bank's CEO would testify before Congress. Federal hearings would be scheduled, settlements would be paid, policies would change. But Edward Mitchell didn't need legislation to validate his worth. He already had his answer, delivered not through politics or profit, but through the quiet strength of one sentence he repeated to anyone who asked what had happened. "I asked for help, and someone answered." And somewhere in a folder on Jasmine Crockett's desk, beneath press clippings and legal drafts, was a wrinkled envelope with faded creases and pen marks and shaky handwriting. Proof that a man once treated like a footnote had become the title of a story far bigger than he ever imagined. The interview had barely wrapped when the footage hit the internet. Clipped from a phone-recorded live stream inside the bank, it captured everything. The humiliation, the confrontation, the confession, and Jasmine's explosive declaration to the press. Within hours, it was everywhere. By midnight, the clip had gone viral, racing across timelines and group chats, exploding on platforms like wildfire. The title alone was enough to stop thumbs mid-scroll. "Elderly man humiliated at bank until Jasmine Crockett steps in." But it wasn't the title that spread like fuel. It was the truth it revealed. The video opened with a shaky shot of Edward standing at the counter, his back slightly hunched, his voice trembling as he tried to explain. Viewers could hear Lindsay's cold reply, see Brian's smug dismissal, and then, like thunder breaking, Jasmine's voice slicing through it all. He's not asking for favors. He's asking for his legal rights. The clip captured every second of her dismantling the system in real time. And finally, Brian's damning confession. Maybe a few hundred accounts. We haven't checked yet. It was over 3 minutes long, far past the modern attention span, and no one could look away. By the next morning, #JusticeForSeniors was trending in 4 countries. News anchors repeated Jasmine's quotes over stock footage of banks. Influencers shared the clip with captions like, "This is what real advocacy looks like." But the most powerful reaction didn't come from likes or comments. It came from screens in living rooms across the country, where older viewers watched, wide-eyed, sometimes in silence, sometimes in tears. In retirement communities in Florida, watch parties were held in common rooms. Residents huddled around smart TVs and whispered names of banks that had charged them unexplained fees. In rural towns in Nebraska, seniors called their children and asked, "Can you check my statement?" In inner-city neighborhoods in Detroit and Houston, families gathered at kitchen tables, flipping through piles of bank paperwork for the first time in years. In church basements, senior centers, veterans' halls, something ancient and urgent had been awakened, a collective question that could no longer be ignored. Have they been stealing from me too? By the end of the day, phone lines at financial law firms were flooded. Pro bono legal hotlines for the elderly reported a 900% spike in calls. Jasmine Crockett's office, once accustomed to 2 or 3 walk-ins a week, now had dozens showing up in person, holding folders, binders, envelopes, some even handwritten notebooks filled with years of suspicious deductions and banking terms they never fully understood. Most didn't come with anger. They came with hope. Hope that someone would finally look. The media dubbed it the Mitchell effect, named after the man whose quiet question had set everything in motion. Journalists traced similar complaints across other banks. Congressional aides requested copies of the video for inclusion in financial ethics hearings. Think pieces flooded the internet with titles like "Digitally Excluded: How Modern Banking Marginalizes the Elderly," and "Policy or Predation: When Convenience Becomes a Cover." And at the center of it all was Edward Mitchell, the man who once stood in silence, now the face of a movement. He wasn't on every screen. He wasn't doing interviews, but his name was in every inbox. His story was in every boardroom. His voice, captured in that moment when he looked Jasmine in the eye and said, "Today I know better. When you're right, you speak up." That sentence became a battle cry for thousands who had been gaslit into silence. Banks across the country scrambled. Internal reviews launched. Policy memos were revised. Language was softened. But it wasn't enough. People were watching now. Jasmine Crockett had not just pulled the curtain back, she had torn it down. Lawmakers began drafting legislation for mandatory plain language disclosures and analog outreach to senior clients. Advocacy groups formed alliances. Clergy members preached on financial justice. Libraries held free financial literacy workshops. Young people sat down with their grandparents, tablets in hand, finally decoding decades of confusion in a single sitting. And through it all, one clip kept playing, over and over again. Not because it was shocking, not because it was viral, but because it was real. A man who had been treated like dead weight proved to the world that he was worth listening to. A woman who refused to look away showed what it meant to lead. And a country, long blind to slow, silent theft, finally opened its eyes. But Jasmine knew viral fame wasn't enough. Justice couldn't survive off trending hashtags and fleeting outrage. It needed roots. It needed a name. So 3 days after Edward's story exploded across the internet, Jasmine stood behind a podium in a crowded press conference, cameras flashing from every angle, and announced what would become a nationwide campaign. One that wasn't just about banking, or one man, or one institution. It was about respect. Too often, she began, her voice steady and amplified by rows of microphones. We measure a person's worth by how current they are, how connected, how tech-savvy, how quick to keep up with a system that's designed to outpace them. And in doing so, we've turned convenience into a weapon. We've turned age into a liability. She paused, letting the silence expand across the room. But not anymore. Today we're launching something bigger than a lawsuit, bigger than one bank. We are launching a campaign called Respect Beyond Age, because dignity doesn't expire when you stop earning a paycheck. Rights don't vanish when you turn 65. And no one deserves to be punished for growing old. The words struck like lightning. Reporters scribbled furiously. Newsrooms cut live to her speech. Social feeds lit up instantly. Respect Beyond Age began trending before Jasmine even stepped away from the podium. Within hours, the campaign's mission statement and toolkit were online. Free, public, simple. Flyers translated into 10 languages. Printable guides sent to churches, community centers, barbershops, senior homes. Volunteers, many of them college students, began making door-to-door visits, offering help reviewing bank statements and utility bills. The campaign wasn't about charity, it was about defense. Jasmine had reframed the conversation. Aging wasn't a weakness, it was a battle you deserve backup in. Edward Mitchell's image was featured prominently, not as a victim, but as the catalyst. A grainy still from the viral video became the campaign's signature poster. Edward standing tall, holding his folder of documents. Jasmine beside him like a shield. The tagline underneath was simple but thunderous. He stood up. Now we stand with him. And people did stand. Marches were organized in over 50 cities, not angry riots, but peaceful walkouts. Thousands of elderly citizens and their allies, dressed in gray and white, holding signs that read, "My wisdom deserves protection, and respect is not a subscription service." Some walked with canes. Some were pushed in wheelchairs. Some came with 3 generations at their side. Together, they moved through downtowns and financial districts, no longer invisible. The generation once ignored had become impossible to unsee. Behind the scenes, Jasmine was tireless. She partnered with tech companies to simplify access for older clients. She held closed-door meetings with CEOs of major banks, reading real stories aloud until they could no longer look away. She launched hotlines, wrote op-eds, created toolkits for identifying silent financial abuse. When she spoke in Congress, she carried Edward's original envelope with her, a reminder of how much weight could be hidden in something so small. But the heart of the movement wasn't in the boardrooms. It was in living rooms, in phone calls, in hospital visits, in grocery lines, where strangers started helping seniors check the payment machines, in grandchildren sitting with their grandparents and saying, "Let's look at this together." For years, a generation had been quietly drained by fees, by forms, by systems built to exclude. And for the first time, they had a banner to gather under, a voice that wasn't speaking over them, but with them. Jasmine stood at the front of every initiative, every panel, every hearing, but she never let people forget where it started. "We launched this because of one man," she said in an interview 6 weeks later. "A man who came in quietly, politely, hoping someone would just explain a charge. They treated him like a burden. They tried to push him out. But Edward Mitchell didn't leave. He stood. And now so will we." And so they did. From senior veterans to retired teachers, from rural farmers to urban grandmothers. A movement that began in a bank branch had transformed into a revolution of dignity, and it carried one truth in every voice, every flyer, every step. Respect isn't earned through speed, it's owed through humanity, and it extends beyond age. And even as the banners were folded, the marches concluded, and the news cycles moved on, one truth still echoed louder than any headline. This was never just about money. It was about memory, about who we choose to protect, and who we too often leave behind. In every city, In every home, the question now hung in the air. Who's watching over those who once watched over us? That's when Jasmine stepped back, not from the fight, but from the center. She had never meant to be the hero of this story. She was just the one who refused to walk away when injustice walked in wearing a tie and a smile. Now, it was our turn. As Edward's name became a symbol, as more families dug into old records and discovered truths they were never told, Jasmine issued one final call, not to outrage, but to action. If you have parents, if you have grandparents, she said in a video now played in classrooms, offices, and living rooms across the nation, protect them. Ask the questions they've been told not to ask. Sit beside them as they scroll through confusion. Stand in front of them when systems push them back. Be the voice they were once for you. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The quiet was already heavy. Because silence, she added, her eyes locked on the camera, has never protected justice. Silence is what injustice feeds on. And if we don't speak, if we don't look, we become part of the theft. The screen faded to black, but her words didn't. They stayed. In every heart that had once overlooked the quiet struggles of an older loved one. In every home where someone opened a drawer of dusty statements and asked finally, "What happened here?" In every soul that had been waiting too long for someone to say it out loud. Don't let silence kill justice. Be louder. Be better. Be like Jasmine. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.